I'm so excited because the first book by Darkness Prevails and Carmen Carrion is available for pre-order right now. It's the Freaky Folklore Compendium, filled with the history and lore of the most terrifying folklore monsters across the globe, alongside some cool but creepy illustrations. Releases July 16th. Pre-order now at eriecast.com/freak or on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and your favorite bookstore. Send your scariest workplace stories to us at eriecast.com/submit and rate and review Tales from the Break Room on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Thanks.
Hi, welcome to Dead and Roasted. What can I get you?
Funny enough, I picked out the last few stories in this episode randomly, and they all happen to involve people who work with animals. So consider today's terrifying set of stories an almost unofficial animal welfare horror stories episode. In honor of this episode, I've decided to import those coffee beans that are pulled straight from the turds of an animal called a civet to be served at Dead and Roasted. It's real, look it up. Every cup served buys a homeless civet a bowl of Kellogg's fruit and fiber. Now then, these are tales from the break room. Nightmare Pizza Deliveries from TheNeighbourhoodWolf. So, I have never really thought to share this story until now. Whenever I discuss this story with family, they dismiss it and think I'm being overly dramatic. But hearing lately about how some people have the same sort of stories as me, I've decided to share this story so that people know it, and know that while it seems easy, working in pizza delivery is not an easy job. With that in mind, I have two stories to share, both at the same job, which I work at now. You think I'd learn, but, well, here we are. A job is a job sometimes, especially in an area where there isn't many options for someone like me. My main job is the driver, delivering pizzas and other food items and drinks to customers. Our establishment is reasonably popular, and due to this, we have a wide delivery range that we deliver to. It covers a total of 6 suburbs, and it can take up to 20 minutes to deliver to those that are furthest away. This can cause some people to be rather upset with us for delivering, accusing us, in their opinion, of being late. But in the stories I'm sharing, I wasn't late. I wish I was. I really do. The first story I'm going to tell happened last year, in July. For context, I live in Australia, so July is in the middle of winter. During a crisp, cold Friday night, I was working late. I won't say which pizza place I work at specifically, just for my own privacy. But I was asked to take 2 deliveries out. Pretty standard fare. The first delivery went out without a hitch. Nice and easy. So I made my way to the next place. The areas I can deliver to vary greatly. I can deliver anywhere from rural areas to suburban ones. This place was an area notorious for being rather sketchy, so my car doors were locked without question. Now, that isn't to say that the area is super dangerous, but there are a couple of known gangs and dealers of certain substances in that area. To give you an idea of what the area is, it's mostly old buildings with overgrown yards, with the occasional nice new house or recently renovated home. There are also a few stores in the area, of the typical corner store fare. I'm thankful that I don't have to deliver to this area that much, once a month if at all, so it's rather comforting to know that I don't deliver there often. I turned onto the street containing the house I was to deliver to. I was feeling kind of creeped out, due to the fact that the street ends with the hugest overgrowth of bushes, vines, and trees, and the houses on each side were overgrown, bushes and grasses gone wild. It's not a great-looking area, but I had to make my deliveries, and this one was the last one of my night. I parked on the street in front of the house. I realized that agreeing to this delivery may have been a mistake, because as I climbed out of the car and grabbed the delivery bag and drink, I saw that the house was set farther back from the curb than I thought. In fact, it was farther from the curb than most of the other houses. It's a popular design choice for a lot of places, but due to the overgrown nature of the yard, it's more eerie than it should be. I noticed that the front door was open. Now, that's not unusual. Sometimes it makes it easier for people to hear me coming. I noticed that the gate was closed. Again, not out of the ordinary, though less common. I opened the gate and stepped inside. The gate creaked as I did so. I let out a shiver, which I attributed to the cold. I then noticed something that made me stop. On the floor in the hallway through the open door was what I thought at first was yellow and black ribbon balled up. When I got to the first step of the house, I noticed it was not ribbon. This was police tape that had been torn off a wall and balled up onto the floor. I assumed it was just, perhaps, Halloween decorations. Sometimes some people like to get stuff prepared earlier for the holidays, and may have been gathering stuff a few months too early. I decided to ignore the feeling in my gut, just thinking that I was overthinking it. I step up to the top of the staircase. At this point, I've not heard or seen anyone. I was about to call out when I saw something that made me step down from the stairs to the door. Inside, in a room off to the side of the entry hallway, was what appeared to be a stained, brownish patch on the carpet. I've seen enough horror movies to know that if something had gotten a splatter of blood on it, the blood will eventually turn a brownish color. This time I could not think up any excuses. I had no explanation for what that brown patch could be. Issue was, sometimes crime was a bit too prevalent in this specific area, so the patch of brown wouldn't be out of place. But I took it into account along with the police tape. So I decided heck no. I took a sharp inhale and started to open the bag up, planning to just leave the food at the door and leave as quickly as I could. As I did, I heard a low, eerie voice from the house.
Oh, finally, the pizza. I'm so hungry.
I stopped moving, raising my eyes to look up inside the house. Standing there in the doorway was a man easily in his mid to late 40s. He had a smile on his face. He was showing off a mouth of yellow teeth as he kept his eyes trained on me. I shivered and stammered, knowing that I needed to leave quickly. "Oh, hi there. I'm really sorry for the wait, sir. We've been falling behind a little today, and we're only now just catching up."
No, it's too cold out there. How about you bring it in here for me? You can place it on the table over here.
I was trying to think of an argument without letting him know that I'd seen too much. I looked above him, and I noticed something else that made me realize that I really had to go. There was a holder above the inner door that looked like it was designed to hold two objects. Only one object was there, an axe. Where was the other item? I decided I just had to go. "Oh, well, I'm not allowed into people's homes, sir. It's against our policies and our safety procedures. Sorry."
How about you just come in here and hand it to me?
My mind was going haywire, but then I was saved. My phone rang. I looked at it. It was my supervisor. I looked up at the man who looked frustrated and smiled. He gritted his teeth and waved his hand, walking back inside.
Just leave it there. I'll get it shortly.
I did as he said, as quick as I could, and quickly answered the phone, walking to my car, turning it on and locking the doors. "Wolf, are you there? You were supposed to be back in the store a few minutes ago. Is everything all right?" "Yeah, I'm fine. Just got caught up with something. I'll be back shortly." You best believe I turned around and got the heck out of Dodge. I've not gone back to that house since, and we've never delivered back to that street. I don't know if the man there was just a squatter that was really creepy, or if he was the cause of that brown stain on the floor, but I'm glad I didn't have to stick around. The next story happened earlier this year. Maybe not as creepy as the first story, but it was sure as heck questionable. During the second week of January, which is the middle of our summer here in Australia, I was delivering to an area that is well known for its motels and hostels. I didn't get to deliver to any of those. Instead, I delivered to a small apartment building with about 10 apartments spread across 2 floors. The worst part? It was a cash delivery, which means I had to take cash to receive a payment. Normally, I hate doing those, but this one made me really upset. I pulled into the only parking spot out front of the place. I noticed that only 2 lights were on outside of the building, so altogether, it was very dimly lit. So I used my phone to light the way to the specific apartment, and when I found it, I knocked on the door. I waited. Before long, I could hear voices inside the apartment. They weren't speaking very loud, they were muttering, and there were 2 voices. I looked around and jumped when I noticed someone was standing behind a wall staring at me. I gave an awkward smile and wave. "Oh, hi there. You startled me. I hope I didn't spook you." The person, a woman with very little hair, slid away behind the wall out of sight. I was creeped out. That was when I noticed the apartment door opened. A man with wild hair covering most of his face was staring at me. I jumped again, thoroughly creeped out. I smiled at him though. "Hi, I have your pizza. The delivery is $41, please." The man stared at me for a second. We stared at each other in uncomfortable silence before he finally spoke in a slurred, slow voice. "Daimo's paying for it. Let me see if I can find him. Daimo!" He started to yell out this man's name for a couple minutes. I waited quietly and patiently, keeping my eye out for that weird woman from before. I then noticed another person staring at me. An angry-looking old man. He was watching me. I heard the man yelling out the name more, but it sounded like he had gone out to the street and was yelling from somewhere else. It was then that a man and a woman came over to me. "He's calling for me, yeah? How much do I owe you?" This man, unlike the others that lived in this building, seemed to be somewhat friendly and not so creepy. I told him the amount. I gave him his change and, well, his food, and bid farewell. I quickly walked out to my car, not looking back. I tossed the empty bag into my trunk and climbed in. I locked the door, then looked out to the building, deciding to chance it. Standing there was the woman, the old man, and the other man who was yelling, all watching me. I gave a slight wave, and they all stepped backwards towards the building, disappearing behind the wall. I let out a sigh of relief, then drove away, quickly driving to the main road. Sometimes I wonder why I remain working there when things like this happen. Other times I'm thankful I have a job that isn't too harsh on me, with people that I get along with. Typically, I'm the member of staff that is sent out for these kinds of jobs, and I'm seen as reliable to the others. Sucks to say that, because it means I'll be doing this kind of thing forever. But again, a job is a job, and thankfully the job has been smooth sailing, other than a couple of weird occasions. To those of you who work in this field, be safe. Remember to lock your doors. And also remember, don't go into their house. The Man in Black, from Ruby B. I guess there's only one place to start. The story I'm going to tell you happened to me during the 5 years I worked as a CNA at a nursing home in my small town. I say small, as in one red light in the whole town, and from my small apartment, I could see the football field out my bedroom window. I started working at this nursing home when I was in my mid-20s. The first year I was there, I worked nothing but day shifts, and I enjoyed my time with most of the residents. But as any healthcare professional will tell you, there are always some residents that are more, well, I guess you could say, difficult. After my first year, there was an opening in the hall I worked for the 7 p.m. shift. I, who had worked night shifts at my previous job, jumped at the opportunity. Day shift was when all the residents had to be fed and bathed, when the place was busy with visitors and bingo. I liked that shift already, but nights were what I wanted from the moment I got hired on. Sadly, there weren't any openings available at the time. I went to the front office, filled out my transfer slip, and crossed my fingers. About a month later, I got called to the office and was told by my supervisor I was going to nights the next week. I just had to wait for the lady who was leaving to work out her notice, as I found out she was retiring and had only 1 week left. The night finally came when I eventually started on the last shift, or overnight shift. When I came in, I was greeted by one of my friends, who usually worked nights. Usually, she'd be clocking out when I was clocking in, but now we got to work together in the hall I'd been on during the day for the last year. Let's call my friend Sam. Sam and I always had fun together, and we got our work done fast, because unlike the girl on first shift, Sam actually helped me. We checked on all the residents, most of whom were already in bed or getting ready for bed. We changed folks who needed changing. The first couple of hours flew by. Around 10 p.m., we had a few call lights for late-night snacks or help to the bathroom, but it wasn't anything that I couldn't handle. Honestly, it was a lot slower paced than the first shift. A few more hours passed of us charting and folding some of the blankets and towels for the first shift, when we heard what sounded like a door opening. We assumed that a resident had gotten up to get us or just couldn't sleep. We had a few that could walk around on their own, and we were used to it on all shifts. As someone who had worked the hall for a year, I knew whose room it was without even having to turn around. So, without looking up from my folding, I said, "Miss Betty, you okay?" No answer. Sam and I both turned around, thinking Miss Betty was playing peekaboo, which she did on a regular basis with a few people who worked with her. To our surprise, her door was shut. We both shook it off at first, but out of the corner of my eye, I saw what looked like a shadow walking into another room across the hall. I worked in a hall full of women, and this was the shadow of a man. I asked Sam if she had seen it too, and before I could finish the question, she said, "Ruby, we need to talk about something." I was puzzled, but agreed, because her face was more serious than before when we were just chatting and folding blankets and towels. We walked behind the desk that allowed us to see clearly down the hall to see every call light in case we were needed. She then took a deep breath and said, "Do you believe in ghosts?" I looked at her and explained that I did believe in ghosts. I had had experiences when I was younger, but never anything here on the job. She smiled at me and replied, "Well, silly, you worked during the day before." The nurse who was working in the hall had come back from her break and was also a friend of mine. Let's call her Angela. She smiled at us and said, "Oh, ghost stories." She had worked day shift with me before switching as well. Angela looked at both of us, then nodded at Sam. "You saw him, didn't you?" Almost laughing, thinking they were joking, I said, "Saw who?" Sam cleared her throat before answering, "The man in black. For the next 10 to 15 minutes, she sat there telling me the story of how when someone is getting ready to pass, they will see the man in black enter the room of the resident. I didn't completely shoot it down, because, like I said, I've seen things before. But I looked at both of them and said, I've been here long enough to know none of these residents seem sick or at death's door. Angela, who had been here the longest, said, Sometimes you don't get a warning. It just happens. She then started getting the medicine trays ready for first shift. We then saw a call light come on. Sam and I both checked the room together. We only had 12 residents on the hall, so between both of us, it wasn't too bad. We got to the room and saw a sweet lady named Miss Ruth trying to use the restroom. I went to assist her when she just pointed to the corner of the room by the bathroom door and said, Tell him to leave. We both looked around and saw no one behind us. About that time, her wheelchair slowly started to roll from the corner. We brushed it off and finally got her to calm down and get back to sleep. Later that night, she would pull her call light 4 or 5 more times until 6:30, and by then it was almost time to go home. Everything was fine after that, and before first shift came in, I had changed a few people, got a few people up, and even got their breakfast cart from the kitchen for them. Around 7 a.m., I saw first shift starting to come in. Before we left, we had to give a report to them, letting them know what happened, who's up, and who's been changed. Those sorts of things. In my report, I told the girl in the hall who I'd worked with before that Miss Ruth had been restless all night, so we'd let her sleep in. We mentioned she said she had seen a man in her room, and without skipping a beat, the older nurse on day shift said, "Oh no." I asked her what was wrong. "I don't want anything to happen to Miss Ruth, but if she's seen him, then it must be true." The older nurse got her cart and all her supplies and took off down the hall. I went home as usual, got some sleep for the next night shift. Sam and I, kind of brushing off the experience we had the night before, came in and chatted. But before we even got to the nurse's station, we heard screaming. "I said, get that man out of my room. I'm scared. He won't leave me alone." We sprinted down the hall, and with both of us being tall with longer legs, it didn't take us long to see Miss Ruth pushing up against a male CNA who had come to help the nurse because she was fighting to get up. They finally moved her to another room, and she fell asleep just around 8 p.m. After that, we were doing our normal folding and answering lights when we heard screaming again. This time, Miss Ruth had gotten herself in her wheelchair and was scooting down the hall screaming, "I don't want to die. Leave me alone." There was no one behind her, but you could see her face. She was very scared. This went on for 2 more days, screaming and yelling until one night on our last day before the weekend, which we were scheduled to be off, we arrived to silence. Miss Ruth was checked out by a doctor who had came around to visit patients who couldn't leave. He told the nurse to make her comfortable because, being an older doctor and seeing things like this before, he thought Miss Ruth didn't have long. That night, we propped Miss Ruth up, made her comfortable, and checked on her almost every hour. Before the next shift came in, Miss Ruth passed away peacefully in her sleep. Like I said, I've seen stuff before, and in the next 4 years I worked there, I experienced several other things, and I even saw the man in black several more times in my hall. Eventually, I left the nursing home after COVID, but as far as I know from friends who still work there, the man in black still comes around to get the residents when it's their time. zoo, cannibals, and the room with the blue door. From Fluffy Coala. I've loved animals since my parents took me to the zoo for the first time when I was a little girl. From that moment on, all I could dream about was that one day, when I became an adult, I would work in a zoo. I dreamed of taking care of some of the most exotic creatures and learning more about them. Luckily for me, about 20 years later, my dream came true. But now that I think about it, I wouldn't call it a dream anymore, because sometimes it seems more like a nightmare. After I finished college, I quickly started looking for job opportunities. I was used to not living with my parents because I had to travel to another city in order to attend college, so the location of the zoo wasn't really a problem for me. Also, I had a good amount of money saved in my bank, and my parents promised to give me some money after I found a job to help me get on and stay on my feet. After 2 months of searching, luck finally smiled upon me, and I was invited for an interview. The zoo that offered me the job, for anonymity's sake I'll just call it Zootopia Zoo, was actually a very popular zoo in my country. It had a very good reputation amongst the community of zoos, so naturally I was very excited. The only downside of the whole story was that in order to actually work there, I had to switch towns. That meant finding an apartment in which I would live, saying goodbye to my old home and friends, and basically starting a new chapter in my life. I'm the type of person who will always chase her dreams no matter the cost, so even before the interview, I decided and told my parents that if I got a job at Zootopia Zoo, I would accept it, and I would be switching towns. The owners of the zoo were a friendly couple named Mario and Hannah. I first met them during an online video call, where they interviewed me. I really liked them so far, and was hoping they would accept me as their worker. The interview went well and they seemed to like me. They told me they were looking for someone who could help them with the daily tasks of cleaning and maintaining the animals' habitats. They also needed someone who could handle visitors, show them around the zoo. I'm a pretty social person, so that wasn't a problem for me at all. I happily agreed to all of the tasks they said that I would need to do. And at that point, our interview was finished. Mario told me he would call me in a couple of days to tell me if I got the job. Fate played its part, and in a couple of days, just as Mario had promised me, he called me and told me the job was mine. Plus, the salary he offered was more than generous. I accepted without hesitation. I had around a month of free time before I would actually start working. First of all, I had to switch towns. That meant saying a lot of goodbyes and finishing all the unresolved things in my hometown. Secondly, I needed to sign some papers for Mario and Hannah before I could start working. A couple of days before starting work, I visited Zootopia Zoo so Mario and Hannah could take me around the zoo, show me things, and explain to me how to do my tasks correctly. I was also introduced to the other workers. Most of them were around 30 to 40 years old, so I didn't really blend in so much. Luckily for me, they were all quite friendly. At the end of the tour, they showed me the entrance door to the freezer. This door had a nice blue coloring and 3 big padlocks on it. They told me I am not allowed to enter the freezer because of sanitary restrictions, and that only they and a few other workers at the zoo could feed certain animals. That meant I could still feed animals that didn't eat meat: zebras, kangaroos, elephants, and so on. I was a little surprised because I didn't really understand their rules, but I didn't question them. After our little tour, Hannah invited me for coffee with her and Mario so we could have a chat. I learned a lot of things related to zoos, about their personal lives, and so on. For instance, Mario had a brother who owned a video surveillance company, which seemed interesting to me. I started working there a few days later, and I was amazed by the variety of animals they had. There were lions, tigers, bears, wolves, monkeys, snakes, crocodiles, and more. They also had some animals that I'd never seen before. Komodo dragons, pink pigeons, Amur leopards. I instantly fell in love with the place. Although Mario and Hannah explained a lot of things, I still needed a lot of help from my coworkers. They would tell me the names, histories, and personalities of animals. They also taught me how to clean their cages and check on their health. They were patient and kind with me, and all of them seemed to care deeply for animals, treating them with respect and affection. They all became like a second family to me. Everything seemed perfect until one night, when I discovered something dark. It was a stormy day from the start. Naturally, we didn't have many guests. We had more time to focus on the animals, though. For me, that gave me more time to work with one of the zebras named Janice. I really loved Janice. It had been sick for some time now and needed special care. It was already dark by then when I finished all my chores, and I was just leaving my stuff and uniform in our changing room when my coworker Hannah entered, saying that Janice had a temperature again. "Can you stay for an extra hour or two and take care of it for me?" she asked another coworker. That coworker didn't have a chance to answer yet when I stopped her and told Hannah that I would do it. "I know I'm new here, but I have a special bond with Janice. I can take care of her." Hannah quickly agreed, telling me that my hard work would be recognized. I put on my raincoat, took a flashlight, and started to head back to the zoo. I walked past the animals, shining my light on each of them. They seemed to be fine, sleeping or resting in their shelters. I reached the zebra enclosure. It took me almost 3 full hours of extra work, but I managed to get Janice's temperature lowered. I forced her to eat some medicine and nutrients. I gathered my things and began to head back to the changing room. At this point, I was really tired, and all I wanted to do was get back to my apartment, take a quick shower, and go to bed. As I was walking back, I was passing by the freezer, and I noticed the blue doors to the freezer were open. I didn't really bother thinking about that room with the freezer because I always had a lot of work to do, but seeing the door open now really woke up my curiosity. I thought to myself, I'll just take a quick peek inside. After that, I'll lock the doors and that's it. I approached the blue door and opened it all the way. I slowly and carefully entered the room. The room was full of big coolers, which I assumed held meat for the animals. In the center of the room was a large desk with knives, saws, and other tools for cutting. I don't know why, but something didn't stop bothering me. I just had to look inside one of the coolers. I tried opening one, but it was locked. I quickly noticed that every cooler had a padlock on it. Why are there so many locks in here protecting meat? I thought. I decided to try opening every cooler in the room. And when I was just about to give up, I found one that wasn't locked. Opening that cooler was the biggest mistake of my life. I opened it and nearly threw up. There were pieces of human bodies, piled up, bloody, mutilated, limbs, organs, even heads. Some of the pieces were still wearing clothes, jewelry, and shoes. Some parts even looked like they belonged to children. I felt sick. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I was far too shocked, too disgusted. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I couldn't believe that Mario and Hannah, the people who had been so nice to me, the people who seemed to love their animals, might be murderers and cannibals, monsters. And I realized, were they feeding this human flesh to some of their animals? Now it made perfect sense why there were such strict rules for the freezer. I decided to get out of there as quickly as possible. I wanted to run away, call the police, and expose their crimes. I turned and began to run towards the changing room so I could get my stuff. But then I stumbled upon Mario. "Hey, what are you doing here?" he gently asked me. I explained to him that I was with Janice and that I'm finally done for the day. He thanked me and told me to get some rest. I just need to make some space in the freezer for tomorrow. We're getting a delivery of fresh meat. After that, I'm going on home too, he added. I almost threw up at the thought of it, this meat delivery, but somehow I managed to control myself. I bid him good night and started to walk again. Moments later, I began to run, even when I heard a violent scream in the distance, the voice of Mario, wondering who had been in the freezer. At that moment, I realized my huge mistake. In a state of shock and fear, I forgot to close the cooler. I still didn't manage to process what I was hearing, but I began to hear rapid footsteps in the distance. Mario, probably assuming that I was in the freezer, was running towards me, yelling that he would kill me. I ran as quickly as I could. I made it to my car and quickly drove away. When I arrived at my apartment, I ran to the phone and called for help. I told the police everything and begged them to look. They said they would, asking me to stay calm. I sat on the couch and waited for the police. Waited and cried. I blamed myself. Why did I have to leave my own town where I had everything? If I stayed there, I never would have saw something like that. When the police arrived, I detailed everything to them once again. They sent an officer to the zoo. They found Mario. They demanded to be shown the coolers. He was arrested. In the next few days, his wife Hannah and their loyal workers, who knew about the crimes, were also arrested. After the incident, I returned to my hometown. I live with my parents now. I found a new job at an animal shelter in my hometown. To this day, I have nightmares about the things I saw in that room. But my parents tell me I should be proud because I stopped Mario and Hannah from hurting anyone ever again. And when I think about it, I suppose they're right. The Tapper, from Columbina. I want to say that this story, at least to me, seems more fascinating than scary. Before the events of the story, I was never a believer in ghosts or demons, or all that other paranormal mumbo-jumbo. I thought that every sighting was the same because people were just unoriginal, and all did the exact same thing, faking stories and experiences for views and attention. But after what happened to me, I'm not so sure anymore. Several years ago, when I was fresh out of college, I was looking for a job. I just moved out of my parents' house and needed money to live, of course. After a while, I stumbled across an old job offer. It was on the last page of a certain job-finding site. It said the offer had already expired. I was desperate, though, and thinking I had nothing to lose, I called the number that was written under the job description. After a few seconds of silence, someone picked up on the other end. I greeted them politely and said how I found their job offer on a site and was wondering if they're still hiring. I wasn't expecting much, honestly. The whole time I was thinking how the old lady on the other end of the line would either just hang up on me or tell me they didn't need anyone anymore. To my shock, she seemed happy that someone was looking for a job. She told me to come down to a specific location for a quick interview. I can't tell you how happy I was that someone at least agreed to interview me. And so, after a few days of waiting, the day finally came when I would be interviewed. I woke up early to style my hair and dress the best I could before I made my way to the location, a zoo. After a 40-minute drive, I arrived at the entrance. As I got out, I looked at this gigantic Jurassic Park-looking gate in front of me. Near it was a small building where you buy tickets. I went over there and explained my situation. The guy working at the booth told me where I needed to go and radioed someone that I was arriving. As I made my way through the zoo, I was constantly looking around at all the different exhibits and all the animals in there. After a while, I arrived at the place I was supposed to be, knocking on the door. I then entered. The room was bigger than I thought. At the very end of it was a man sitting and doing paperwork on a small wooden table. He greeted me, and we soon began to talk about the job and my education and past job experiences. Long story short, I was hired, and I would begin work the next week. Since I had never worked at a zoo before, or with animals for that matter, I would be accompanying one of the older workers for a few months so he could show me around, teach me how things were done. Now, I didn't particularly like or dislike animals. I was kind of just indifferent to them. But I needed the job, so I told myself I'd do the best I can. Monday soon arrived. My new job officially started. In the early hours of the day, I met with a guy who was supposed to be my trainer. He was an older guy, in his late 30s or early 40s, named Ivan. Although he looked kind of intimidating, he was quite friendly and understanding of my situation when I told him why I took the job. Ivan had a strong accent, but I can't really tell from which country it was. I never asked, though, but I recall him telling me that his family moved to America when a war broke out in his home country. I spent my first day just following him around while he explained and showed me all the different jobs I'd have to do in the future. I was listening closely, trying to remember everything he said, but I never could have imagined that there was so much to this job that I would be expected to have to memorize so much. Months passed after the first day. I gradually took on more and more tasks, first with Ivan doing the majority of the work, and me doing the backup. Eventually, I began to do half, then the majority, until I was finally ready to begin working on my own. Naturally, over time, Ivan and I became friends, despite the age gap. One day, as we were closing up, Ivan asked me if I wanted to go out for a cup of coffee or to get something to eat. Not seeing a problem with that, I accepted. We went to a small coffee shop that was at the corner of the street, not too far from the zoo. When we sat down, Ivan had this weird, almost puzzled expression on his face. We ordered coffee, and I began to make some small talk before he brought up something.
Now, I'm not supposed to tell you this yet, but boss said you'll be on your own soon. You're going to be transferred to west side of zoo, where the big cats are, he said with his thick accent. I showed you ropes. We worked there the most, so you'll be fine. Probably. He continued, still with a worried look on his face. But listen, boy. Now that you'll be on own, you'll sometimes have to stay at zoo longer than usual. You know, documentation, stuff like that. And at night, the cats begin acting strange.
His face now showed clear signs of discomfort, but he went on.
My buddy Gabe. You know Gabe, right? The security guard. Yes, him. He said that at night, the lions start to act aggressively, and they sometimes shriek like someone just stepped on their tails. He said that the previous worker told him he heard strange noises all around the exhibit. Now, I'm not saying it's haunted or anything of the sort. Just be careful.
I thought he was joking at first, but his facial expression did not change. It was still in that state of concern. I didn't know what to think of what he told me. Sure, we were in that side of the zoo a lot, but I never got any weird feelings when we were there. Never heard anything out of the ordinary. Not trying to be rude to Ivan, I thanked him for the consideration, and I told him I'd be careful, that I'd be all right. As we finished our coffee, Ivan offered to walk me back to my car. As we were talking, the night had already crept up on us. Before I got in my car, Ivan said, "Just be careful over there, okay? If anything feels off, don't hesitate to call help." I thanked him again, telling him that I promised I would. I drove home, still unsure of what to make of the conversation and the story. Despite Ivan's warning, I tried to brush off his concerns as nothing more than superstition. After all, I had spent countless hours on the west side of the zoo with him, and I had never once experienced anything weird. Still, a nagging sense of unease did begin to linger in the back of my mind as I drove home in the dark. Over the next few days, either from Ivan's ominous warnings or the stress from finally working alone, I found myself growing increasingly apprehensive about my impending transfer to the big cat enclosure. Every time I thought about it, a sense of dread came over me, leaving me feeling unsettled and on edge. The day of the transfer arrived. After a quick chat with my boss about my new duties, I walked down the hall and entered the west side of the zoo. It looked normal, the same way it looked every other time I was there with Ivan. I began to go to work just as he taught me. It took some time getting used to finally being alone, but I was okay pretty quick. The first 2 weeks of working the west side all by my lonesome were quite boring. Nothing crazy happened. I was so preoccupied with work that I completely forgot about Ivan's words, but I would soon remember them. One day I had to stay behind after hours to finish up paperwork. I was walking around the lion exhibit, trying to quickly get to the office and be done for the day, when I heard something. It sounded like someone tapping on the glass or on a window with their finger. I looked around, but I didn't see anyone. Then I heard it again, and it sounded like it was right behind me. Quickly, I turned around, but once more, I didn't see a soul. Annoyed, I yelled out, "Stop doing that! It isn't funny! You're disturbing the animals!" But I got no answer. At least, the tapping stopped, though. I looked around for a bit to see if someone really was there making a fool out of me, or if I was just hearing things. Shortly after that, I returned to the office and began to quickly fill out the rest of the paperwork. I was nearly done when I was startled by a loud roar from outside. I froze for a few moments, and when I recollected myself, I went out to check out what was going on. I made my way to the lion exhibit, where I saw a lioness pacing around its enclosure, obviously agitated. I looked around to see if something was happening in the enclosure, but everything seemed fine. I returned to the office. As I sat there trying to shake off the unease that settled over me, I could not shake the feeling that something was wrong. I tried to distract myself, focusing on the paperwork, hoping that once it was done, I could finally leave the zoo behind and put the strange occurrences of the night behind me. And then, just as I was about to complete the last of the paperwork, I heard it again, that tapping sound. It was faint at first, but grew louder and more insistent with each passing moment. I glanced nervously around the room, searching for the source of the sound. But there was nothing there. No one else in the office, no windows, no doors to tap against. It was just me, alone in a dimly lit room, with the sound growing louder and more frantic by the second. At that point, I was seriously freaked out. I rushed out of the room, only to be greeted by the sounds of angry, restless lions from next door. I radioed the security guard to check if someone was out there. After a little while, he radioed back, saying I'm the only one here. Creeped out, but with no other choice, I finished up the paperwork and clocked out for the night. The next day, I went over to Gabe, the security guard, asking him again if someone was there with me. His answer was the same as the night prior, but he didn't seem surprised. When I asked him what was up, he told me how this has been happening for a while now. A strange tapping noise near the lion's exhibit which then wakes them up and irritates them. He said the previous worker at the west side heard the same thing, and they spent days trying to figure out if something was wrong with the glass or with the pipes. But after investigating, nothing was wrong. Everything seemed fine. At least before they checked the security cameras. When they did, they saw something unexplainable. When the previous worker reported the noise, something that looked like a small speck of dust was seen on the camera, moving through the halls almost intelligently, only to stop at the lion exhibit. They checked the recordings of every night the noise was heard, and every time the same thing was seen, the speck of odd dust. When he told me that, I was bewildered, to say the least. I couldn't believe what he was saying, and I demanded to see said footage. I guess I was pushy enough, because eventually he did let me watch it. Sure enough, I could see myself walking down the hall, and a small speck of dust followed me for a moment and stopped at the lion's exhibit. It's been a while since this story took place, and every time I was left alone in the west side of the zoo, the tapping would appear. I grew to ignore the sound, and now view it more as a thing of fascination than something to fear. Essential Drive, from Lainey. I work emergency on the weekends at a large veterinary hospital. My shift begins at 5 a.m., and I leave the house at 4:15 a.m. Although I live in a very large Midwestern city, it's always a quiet drive in on Sunday mornings. Very few of the city folk are out at that time. Many of them have just gone to bed, as it is the weekend. That doesn't bother me at all, as during the day the streets are always overcrowded, and it's a nice respite from the normal gridlock. It was a Sunday, March 28th, 2020. I remember the date exactly, as it was the day after the governor of the state had issued a shelter-in-place order in response to the COVID outbreak. Because I worked in the veterinary medical field at an ER hospital, I was deemed essential, and my routine carried on as normal. I woke up at 3 a.m. when the alarm began making its annoying binging sound, waking me from my restful sleep, and I started to get ready for work. There were dogs to feed and let out, lunch to be packed, and coffee to be made. It was a typical Sunday morning before work. I left at my usual time, soon noticing that the roads were even quieter than normal. There was virtually no one out besides myself and the occasional police vehicle, to the point of it being surreal. As I made my way to work on the quiet streets, I came to a divided highway, with 2 lanes of traffic going each way. The speed limit on that road is 40 miles per hour. Not that anyone obeys that law. However, it was dark out, and frankly, I was enjoying having the world to myself, so that day I drove the speed limit. As I was driving down the right lane of the road, it barely registered to me that it seemed darker than it normally did at that time. I didn't put that much thought into it until suddenly, almost like someone placed a thought in my head, I thought a dog was in the road in front of me in the far distance. I squinted my eyes and looked into the dark in front of me. I didn't see anything, so I ignored the thought and continued driving down the right lane. But then the distinct thought that there was a dog in the lane in front of me blasted right back into my head. I decided no longer to ignore this warning. I quickly merged over to the left lane. Just as I did so, I looked over at the right. There was a man walking steadily down the middle of the right lane straight towards me. As I passed him going 40 miles per hour in the lane to the left, he never once looked over at me. He just continued his slow and steady walk down the road. My first thought was, thank God that I didn't hit him. Then I felt extremely grateful that I'd paid attention to the voice in my head. But then I realized how strange the situation was. There are sidewalks and frontage roads off this road, plenty of places to walk. Why would some man be walking down the middle of the road? And why did I keep getting the thought that a dog was in the road when I saw nothing? I glanced back in my rearview mirror as I continued to drive, but I saw no one. It was as if he had just faded away, or perhaps had become completely shrouded by the strange and now eerie darkness. What happened next was completely out of character for me. I usually think about situations like this over and over, ruminating on them in my head. But as I kept driving, the whole event just faded away. I can only compare this to a dream when one wakes up with a vague recollection of the dream, and then it just wanes away as the day goes by. A couple of days later, I suddenly recalled the incident, and I began thinking about how strange it was. As I drove to work the next weekend at the exact same time, I paid careful attention to the section of the highway where I'd seen that man walking. I immediately realized I could, in fact, see in the distance if any figures were walking there. The lights from the surrounding businesses and streetlights made it possible. It seemed so much brighter compared to that morning, although it was the same time of day with similar weather. So why had it been so dark the weekend before? A few months later, I was at work when a client came in, and I observed that her last name was the same as the name of the road I'd been driving down the morning of the strange occurrences. I asked her if she was somehow related to that road. She told me that her in-laws used to own the land where the road was built. Casually, in a joking manner, I told her I saw a ghost on that road, or something very strange. She immediately became very interested. She told me that her mother-in-law had many stories of strange events on the property before it was sold. I'm not really sure who that man was that night. I have no idea why it was so dark or why the whole occurrence just faded away after it occurred. I continue to be grateful to whomever warned me to pull over, and I often wonder who exactly gave that warning to me. Because whether the man was a normal guy or something supernatural, I know someone was protecting me from hitting him. And deep down inside, I know that there was some type of good versus evil occurring that morning, and I was being put to a spiritual test. Although I don't understand any of it, I'm so glad I listened to that voice. Tales from the Break Room is a viewer-submitted podcast featuring allegedly true scary stories that happened on the way to, on the way from, or at work. If you want your story to be narrated on the show, send it to us at eriecast.com/submit. As of April 14th, we're paying 3 cents per word for stories that are approved and make it onto the show. Submission does not guarantee approval or payment. For a limited time only, PayPal only. Tales from the Break Room is an EerieCast Network original podcast hosted by Darkness Prevails. You can follow him on Twitter at Dark Prevails, and you can hear thousands more stories read by him on our other show, Unexplained Encounters. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow and rate Tales from the Break Room on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. You can also enjoy plenty more horror-themed podcasts at EerieCast.com.